Good evening. Welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. I'm PEG board member Dave Wilson, and I'll be co-moderating tonight's event along with another PEG board member, Jeff Williams. PEG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Spokane, Washington. We are a nonpartisan coalition that organizes and holds public events, calls attention to problems and issues that we face as a community, region, and nation, and presents possible solutions to these challenges through sincere and civil discourse. PEG's mission is to support and defend America's representative democracy, promote effective government at all levels, and advocate for a civil and just society. Primary goal of PEG is to influence public policy in a fashion that advances our mission. As a reminder, the views presented by tonight's guest speaker are his own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in any political activity of any kind. Our speaker will give a 30 to 60 minute talk, and then he will open it up to questions and answers. Our audience is welcome to submit brief questions at any time via the Q&A feature. Please limit your questions to 2 or 3 sentences, and you are welcome to ask several questions, but please submit only 1 question at a time. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum around 8:30. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted within a couple of weeks on our website, which is pegnow.org. And in addition, TVW is streaming this event and recording it for future viewing on their channel. The title of tonight's presentation is Afghanistan, Ukraine, and the New World Disorder After the American Era. Our guest speaker is retired career U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, and I have the honor of introducing him. Ambassador Crocker served our country in the U.S. Forest Service for 40 years. While some diplomats get to serve in such places as tropical paradises or cosmopolitan settings like Paris or London, Ambassador Crocker spent his entire career in the Middle East. During that long career, he was stationed in about a dozen different Middle East countries, 6 of them as ambassador. He was ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. Ambassador Crocker has also been recognized for his significant contributions and achievements. September 2004, President George W. Bush conferred on him the diplomatic rank of Career Ambassador. This is the highest rank in the Foreign Service, equivalent to a 4-star officer in the military. In January 2009, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bush. This is the nation's highest civilian award. In July 2012, Crocker was named an honorary Marine by the United States Marine Corps, and in their long and storied history, less than 100 people have earned that distinction. In 2020, the West Point Association of Graduates awarded Crocker the prestigious Thayer Award for exemplifying the Academy's motto, duty, honor, and country. And that award is only given to 1 person each year. Since leaving government service, Mr. Crocker has taught at the University of Virginia, Yale, and Princeton. And here's the best part to this long introduction. Ambassador Crocker was born in Spokane. He's a graduate of Whitman College in Walla Walla. Members of PEG believe deeply in the good work of the State Department and the U.S. Foreign Service and the vital role it plays in protecting American interests and world peace. General James Mattis said it best while he was Secretary of Defense. If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. The members of PEG are very grateful to Ambassador Crocker for agreeing to be our March speaker. Mr. Crocker, the Zoom space is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, and good evening to all of you out there in Zoom land. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity this evening. It is a hinge of history where we sit right now. An established old order is giving way to what we're not entirely sure, but the stakes are enormous. Thank you for that, Dave, for that generous introduction. As you were going through it, it called to mind when you mentioned the Medal of Freedom. The two Foreign Service officers have received the Medal of Freedom. I was one of them. The other was Phil Habib, who did his undergraduate work at the University of Idaho in Moscow, where he majored in forestry. So the only two Foreign Service officers to receive the Medal of Freedom were both connected to the Inland Empire. I delight in pointing that out to my friends on the East and West Coast. When giving young people advice, when they ask what they should major in college to have a shot at the Foreign Service, I say, well, try forestry. Or you can go my route, English, Lit, and philosophy. Stay away from political science. So again, just a couple of reflections. I was ambassador 6 times, 3 times for Democratic administrations, 3 times for Republican administrations. That would be very, very hard to do right now. Our Foreign Service, like our military, is avowedly apolitical. Nobody elects us. We follow the orders given by those who did meet the test of the people. But our politics have become, I think, so charged that it would be very difficult for even a career officer to avoid getting painted with one brush or the other, and that is sad. Another observation I would make is I've seen our cultural wars within this country move through various phases. I often thought, you know, I've seen this stuff before. I've heard it before. Well, yes, I had in places like Baghdad, Kabul, Beirut. So where a kind of a zero-sum mentality rules, where your adversary is actually your enemy, where there can be no compromise, because compromise means concession, concession means defeat, and defeat is death. So I worry very much, frankly, about the state of our nation right now, and it does affect everything we see out, or most everything we see outside our own borders. So again, Dave, I would salute you and your fellow directors and all of you tuning in this evening for your commitment to a different kind of local, regional, and national dialogue. I hope that as we emerge from this awful pandemic, that we may take some lessons from it, that we do far better when we unite in common purpose than we do when we try to fight each other. And fighting is, of course, certainly what is going on as we gather here this evening. The war in Ukraine grinds on. Absolutely clear there is not going to be a swift end to it. We can all make our educated, half-educated, and uneducated guesses as to what's going to happen next. Why did Putin do this? What are the possible outcomes? What I would say myself is that, again, looking at the Ukraine or any other major problem, and goodness knows there's plenty of them, avoid monocausal answers. The world is a complex place, and whatever the event is, to attribute it to one single factor or point is probably just going to lead you farther astray. So in the case of Ukraine, why did Putin do this? What was he thinking? Well, it's useful to look back not very many years. As you may recall, Putin outright annexed the Crimea in 2014, made it formally a part of Russia. At the same time, Russia was supporting, if not instigating, pro-Russian elements in in the east of Ukraine, in what's called the Donbass region. Kind of messy and confusing exactly what was going on there, but very clear that Russian proxies were wresting control of that area from the Ukrainian state. The West didn't do very much about either of those episodes. And it would not be too far afield to imagine that Putin said, okay, did the Crimea thing, I did the Donbass thing, nobody moved, nobody flinched. Time to go for the whole deal. So that'd be one vector for seeking to understand what Putin is doing and why he may be doing it. Another, and it's not mutually exclusive, is, of course, my own area of expertise in the Middle East. Libya, where Putin thought he heard from us that Russia needed not to involve itself in the Libyan civil war in those heady days of the Arab Spring, that we were not seeking to see Gaddafi, a longtime Russian ally, Soviet ally, ousted from power. Well, of course, that was exactly what happened. He was ousted from power and of course, killed. The Russians played that back to us in Syria. They needed nor wanted no assurances from us. They were going into Syria to protect their own interests. Syria, in a very curious way, I think, was a dress rehearsal for what we're seeing now in the Ukraine. Most Americans didn't follow Syrian events with any real focus. But what you're seeing today in Ukraine was test marketed by the Russians in Syria to a marked degree. Take those humanitarian corridors. Exactly the same process. The Russians, working with their Syrian government allies, would agree to a humanitarian corridor, only to then shut it down the next day by military action. And eventually, the purpose of the safe corridors was to eliminate actual or potential enemies, or at least to move them from areas that the Syrian government and the Russians considered strategic into other areas where they could not mount much of an effective resistance. The deliberate targeting of civilian areas, Oh, yes, indeed. We saw a lot of that in Syria, primarily in the city of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. Just horrific kinetic effort by Syria and Russia, using their air power, their artillery, and their armor to force an evacuation of really tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. One of our more prescient observers styled that as the weaponization of refugees, knowing that they would seek to get into Europe, and that could prove to be a very divisive factor inside of Europe, which is, again, exactly what happened. One area, I've been involved in refugee affairs for some time. As we look at the refugee flows now out of Ukraine, but we saw that again in Syria, where 2015, 2016, thousands of Syrian refugees drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean to get into Europe. The view of the administration at that time was, gee, that's tough. But it looks like that's a Middle East problem, a European problem, an African problem, but it's not an American problem. And again, as we keep this within a broader context of a shift in the world order, you think back to World War II, where our ground forces in Europe after VE Day had as a primary mission policing up refugees along known routes of migration, getting them somewhere safe and warm, and then moving them along to the next stage. We didn't do that this time around. And again, when I talk about a hinge of history and the American role in it, that the difference between the US and refugees in Europe 1945 versus 2015, we were not playing a global role at all, to say the least. The other point I would make, again, as you look back at Syria, all of this that happened before, that what is being done now in the Ukraine happened before. Well, yeah, we didn't pay much attention to that, and now we're paying a whole lot of attention. So why that discrepancy? Well, I'll just give it to you straight. Ukrainians are white people who actually have nice cities, and they're Christians. Syrians, not so much. There's some of those brown-skinned Arabs, and even worse, they're mainly Muslims. So if you contrast the non-reaction in Syria to the reaction now in Ukraine, I think that's a hard question that we as Americans have to ask ourselves. I certainly don't like the answer that I've just given, but I think it's important that every now and then, we do try to confront reality instead of sugarcoating it with some fancy tale of our own devising. And then, of course, there is Afghanistan. And I do believe that what happened in Syria, what happened in Afghanistan, very much was an influence on the thinking of Vladimir Putin. Well, I don't need to retell for you the catastrophe the Afghan withdrawal was. Just horrific and totally avoidable. The collapse of the Afghan government and Afghan security forces. President Biden, in one of his more shameful moments, said from the White House, well, if they're not going to fight for their own country, why should we be there? Well, they did fight and die for their country for years. Over 70,000 members of the Afghan security forces were killed in that conflict. that solidarity was breached, quite frankly, when President Trump decreed that we would negotiate an end to our involvement in the conflict with the Taliban, but the Afghan government would not be in the room. That was a longstanding Taliban demand. They would talk to the Americans. They would not talk to the puppets of the Americans. And as I said at the time, once President Trump announced that decision, it was really clear what was going to happen, that these were not peace talks, they were surrender talks. It was not completely unlike the Paris peace talks that ended the US involvement in the Vietnam War. Same kind of modalities. Delegitimize the government that you're supporting, as long as that will get you out of what you're involved in. Then we added injury to injury by forcing the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, most of whom immediately rejoined the fight against Afghan security forces. So a little hard to keep up your morale when your outside support is now having chummy conversations with your sworn enemy. But they did fight on. And what finally, I think, broke the back of the Afghan military and national police was the withdrawal of all air support. We had created a system in Afghanistan monitored on our own, whereby relatively small numbers of ground forces would be pushed out forward and then backed up by air support, medical evacuations, close air support when necessary, resupply. Well, in Afghanistan, they were pretty good pilots, but they were nowhere close to being able to manage all the maintenance requirements for sophisticated US-built airframes, which meant that when our troops were drawn down, so were our contractors, written into their contracts. And the Afghans were left with air assets that they could no longer fly because they couldn't be maintained. So I give you that long screed because it still keeps me up at night. And I do think that catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan and the resonance it still has around the region and the world, clearly a factor as well in Putin's thinking. That, well, he's seen the Americans in Syria doing nothing. He saw the Americans in earlier Russian attacks in the Ukraine area do nothing. And he certainly saw the Americans throw in the towel and exit Afghanistan in a manner that left the Soviet retreat look positively orderly and well organized. So I would suggest to you all of that combined to influence President Putin's thinking. So now what? Where are we now in the Ukraine, and what can we see as we try to look forward? The first thing I would say is that as badly as the administration botched Afghanistan, and it really, frankly, would be hard to imagine them doing it any worse, even if they tried, well, Ukraine's about the mirror image of doing it right. With a couple of exceptions, I think the Biden administration's approach top to bottom, you really could not improve on it. The early decision by the administration that we had to keep together, we had to be united in our response for that response to have any hope of affecting Putin's strategic thinking, and we were. That same NATO organization that was so appalled by our actions in Afghanistan, many of our NATO partners had, of course, forces on the ground that all of a sudden they had to evacuate. The administration reached out to our NATO partners, got it on the agenda early, did hours of consultations and conversations to get everybody on board for a common policy, which was centered on sanctions, and has kept it there by and large. And, you know, we saw some things that I really thought we would never see. Germany's early decision to suspend the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which will cause significant pain in Germany. You know, very nice to see that our European partners stepped up as partners, prepared to assist the effort in any way that made sense. And again, the focus on sanctions, I think, was the right thing to do. That the economy has always been Russia's greatest weakness. I mean, it was economic failure as much as anything else that brought the Soviet Union down. The economy hasn't been looking any better since then. So this is a case where sanctions, I think, can actually have a huge impact, and we have seen it. The Russian stock market has been closed. The ruble is rapidly losing value, and some very hard times are ahead for the Russian people. The decision, the extraordinary decision to lay out the intelligence, declassify it, and put it out there of our read on Russian intentions before this hot war started. You know, we've all governments selectively leak intelligence depending on the scenario they're facing, but I've never seen anything on the scale that we just did. The intelligence was by and large accurate, and very convincing, both to allies and adversaries. So I give the administration great credit for that as well. What we are seeing now, of course, is certainly not the swift collapse of the Ukrainian military that Putin was hoping for. As we move into more than 5 weeks of this conflict, it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians are not about to run up the white flag in whole or in part. And that, of course, at one level is a very good thing for the world to see the difference between a Russian aggression and a stalwart defense, though badly outgunned and outnumbered by not just the standing military, but volunteers up and down, as we've seen in Ukraine. It's a good news story. It also poses some additional challenges. Lots of pressure, for example, on the Biden administration to establish a no-fly zone. They have thus far resisted that. I think they're right to do so. I know a little bit about no-fly zones from my time in Iraq. To make a no-fly zone work, the first step has to be neutralizing all ground defenses that could shoot down our aircraft, and that would mean direct attacks on Russian air defense elements, not just in Ukraine either, in Russia proper, because of the range of the current generations of surface-to-air missiles. So a highly escalatory step that, again, I think the administration has been prudent to avoid. The problem is, as this war grinds on and as we are treated to the horrific images of the results of targeting on civilians, pressure is going to grow for more robust action. So staying steady is going to be a challenge. Again, I consider that the administration has done it right so far. Their particular focus, again, is keeping a global and certainly a European coalition together and supporting an effective set of measures against Russia. again, primarily the sanctions. And I think, again, the administration was right to kind of measure out the sanctions, starting with the series, going to another series. And I think there was another announcement of yet more sanctions again today. So keeping allies together, keeping adversaries off balance. So far, a very good job. But as this war grinds on, pressures will rise. And I think the administration is going to have to, again, adapt to that. The good news is that by and large, they've shown good judgment, clear thinking, a sense of pace, and again, the imperative of keeping a broad coalition pretty much on the same page. Okay, let me take a step back and again, just situate this in the larger context. I really think we are now looking at kind of the opening phases of the New World disorder. America was decisive in winning World War II. It was also decisive in devising and then leading the post-World War II international order. Roosevelt and Truman, of course, were keenly aware of our own history, that Woodrow Wilson had gone to Versailles after the First World War had ended, with his famous 14 points and his vision of creating a new democratic order in Europe that the United States would strongly influence. Well, it didn't work out that way, and isolationist Senate refused to ratify the treaty. And the Europeans, mainly the Brits and the French, really didn't want the upstart Americans messing around in their own backyard. Well, different story after World War II. We did design that new order, the San Francisco Conference for the United Nations, Bretton Woods, that moved the world from the gold standard to the dollar, NATO. That was all visionary, and it was all dedicated for two objectives. The one we all know of confronting the Soviet Union and its allies, but the other to keep Europe united and to keep Europe from going down the path that they had gone down that produced 2 world wars and the Holocaust. So we are at this hinge now when the United States' role is, as a global leader, very much in question, not just by our allies, but also by our adversaries, and most fundamentally by our own people. Isolationism has always been a trend in American foreign policy. It goes back to the founding fathers and avoiding foreign entanglements. Having just said that they would avoid foreign entanglements, of course, we were into action pretty smartly at the beginning of the 19th century against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. But that theme has always been part of our politics, and it resurfaced under President Obama in a fairly explicit way. I referred to the decision not to make an effort to protect and save the lives of refugees. We knew where they were crossing. We've had a numbered fleet, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean since World War II. I could ask you how many times you can recall in those awful years, 2015, 2016, that you can recall an American naval vessel sailing to the rescue of a foundering refugee craft? Well, the answer is one big round zero. Sixth Fleet was under orders to avoid any of the known routes for these wretched small boats because we didn't want to deal with it. So as we see the administration pursue a collective policy against Russia, the backdrop, I think, is still there. That the drift now is toward a post-American ascendancy world. What does that mean? And is it a bad thing? Well, really, there are only two choices on this kind of stuff. If you don't have a dominant party and power, you default to a balance of power system where different alliances and coalitions form and reform, pragmatic in the most cases, situational, that countries cooperating in one area may be adversaries in another. The mix and match has all kinds of possible formulations. What does that mean? What's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with a balance of power system per se, until it becomes unbalanced. And that's how we got World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust. I think clearly one would put Syria and now the Ukraine in that category, where major powers will seek to dominate lesser powers, and in so doing, will look for support elsewhere. That's partly what we're seeing now, I think, with the Russian-Chinese rapprochement. The difficulty again is it gets really, really complicated and I think prone to unintended consequences. Nobody wanted World War I. They got it anyway. As again, balance of powers got out of kilter. So in that sense, I think it is really a frightening time because as bad as World War I and World War II were, and they were horrendous, we now have a lot of nuclear weapons out there, including so-called battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons that can be used literally on the battlefield. They don't have to be dropped from a B-52. So, whatever comes next could be a period of very grave challenge for all of us, for America and for the entire world. And that is why I think the outcomes in Ukraine are so important. Can we stay the course here? Can we overcome our strategic impatience to be in this for the long haul? We're not very good at strategic patience. Something else our adversaries have come to count on, as they did in Afghanistan, and our allies to fear. So we have a chance now, I think, to construct a somewhat different narrative, but the centrifugal forces will continue to be at work. I think tugging away at coalitions, sapping their strength and offering alternatives that may be attractive for the moment, but can be very dangerous in the long term. So again, going forward, I think it's extremely important that we, all of us, keep in mind the larger issue out here, that the world does not run by itself, as Secretary Blinken said some time ago. So it does not, and it has not really since 1945. Um, most of you would recall the Bosnian War in the 1990s. The horrific scenes we saw, the siege of Sarajevo, the massacre of thousands of Bosnian men and boys, literally under the guns of a United Nations peacekeeping force. When the Bosnian conflict erupted, President Clinton said, very rightly, I thought, look, this is a European war. You know, these places are in Europe. I mean, the Europeans need to sort this out. It's their own territory. You know, and it was a great statement of principle. Unfortunately, as we saw tragically, the Europeans couldn't sort it out. It took America. The Dayton Accords that brought an end to the hot conflict were signed in Dayton, Ohio, not Dayton, France. And again, as we look at the Ukraine, I see something similar. If the US does not lead, no one will. And if no one leads, then we are looking at a real, a complete breakdown, I think, of an international order that has endured for so many years. Over 75, again, under American leadership, not American hegemony leadership. My fear is not that the Chinese is going to replace us, China is going to replace us. They can't. No one can do this. And in that sense, how Ukraine plays out over the longer term, whether US leadership will continue, whether others will continue to work with us, all unresolved questions. But I do think this is going to be a huge test of what kind of world, what kind of system or systems are going to rise and perhaps fall in the years ahead. It will affect the security of all of us, of all nations and of all peoples, including Americans. We no longer have the luxury of the great buffers of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. They don't mean that much in a nuclear world, and a lot to worry about around the world. And the final thing I would say, just to try to indicate the complexity, the continuing fallout from Afghanistan. I spent 3 years as ambassador to Pakistan, and still stay in touch with folks I knew back then. Well, the Pakistanis had said for years, look, guys, we're not gonna move against the Taliban that are are seeking refuge in Pakistan, because we know you guys, you're gonna leave. Sooner or later, you're gonna leave. We can't leave, we actually live here, and we do not need to turn the Afghan Taliban into a mortal enemy to please you and then be left holding that particular bag. So they had about 15 minutes of celebration as we were making our final departure from Kabul. And then the new reality set in. And that new reality is that our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way in which the Taliban retook power was a powerful, powerful narrative that did not stop at Afghanistan's borders. The Taliban was able to say, and has been saying, clad only in the armor of the one true faith, we vanquished the infidels. Well, it's pretty clear that the Pakistani Taliban are picking up that slogan and have felt a huge injection of power and strength. The Pakistani Taliban does not concern itself with Afghanistan. It seeks an overthrow of the Pakistani state in Islamabad. And we are seeing now the strains and turmoil inside Pakistan growing. Bear in mind, Pakistan also has nuclear weapons, and it has tactical nuclear weapons to offset its size disadvantage vis-a-vis India. So it's not just Russia, Ukraine, Europe, NATO, the United States. That's big and bad enough. We are also seeing the ripples of Afghanistan, and again, the sense of a US withdrawal elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East. That brings its own sets of dangers. So the world's always been a pretty tricky neighborhood to live in. Well, it's getting a whole lot trickier. And we're going to see that, I'm afraid, at every level going forward. But that's why I think it is crucial that we maintain a united front vis-a-vis Russia in the Ukraine, do everything we can to make those sanctions stick, again, through broad observance by the international community, again, under US leadership, and that we support from within the leadership, our leadership, playing that global role. So let me just stop there and turn this into something far more interesting, which will be a dialogue instead of my nearly endless monologue. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. It's now time to field some questions from the audience. So if you have not done so, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature as specified in the opening of tonight's forum. My co-moderator, Jeff Williams, and I will alternate reading questions. And Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and let you ask the first question from the audience.
Right on. Thank you. Hear me okay?
Yep. Loud and clear.
That's a yes?
Yes.
Right on. Okay. Well, no surprise here. The World War II came up, and here it is right out the gate. So here's the question, Ambassador. It has been said that the current situation with regard to Russia's actions against Ukraine look a lot like 1939 in Europe. In what ways is that true, and in what ways is that not true?
Well, the most fundamental way in which it is not true, of course, is our role. It was our absence from the field in the 20 years between World War I and World War II that allowed the development of the forces that we saw play themselves out in Europe, and again, eventually in the full-blown World War II. So, you know, the American role, don't discount it. The dangers are great, but we have shown under this administration that we can lead. We just have to show that we have staying power, that we're not going to get, there are two dangers here, quite frankly, and they're polar opposite. One is that we get kind of panicked into a measure or a set of measures that could turn this into a direct US-Russia armed conflict, bringing in NATO, and God knows where things go then. It's also the other danger is the opposite one, that we just decide, this is too hard, we're never going to get there, this can grind on forever, we just gotta, you know, go find something else to do. So avoiding those twin dangers is now the challenge for US diplomacy. And again, a fundamental difference between 1938 Europe and 2022 Europe. Other other differences, again, as well, that we are not, while the era of the American ascendancy may be fading, it also may be capable of rejuvenation, and that may be what's going on right now. We know what it all looked like in 1938. I don't think anybody wants to see that go forward. But it's also a reminder of some fairly enduring things. This is not the first time that the Ukraine has been contested by great powers. Both the Soviet Union and the German Reich looked at Ukraine as kind of the breadbasket, and not really as a sovereign state. We're getting the Russian mythology now. Well, Hitler had the same kind of mythology, talking about the black earth of Ukraine, its fertile agricultural soil. So there are differences, there are similarities. And that would take me back to a point I touched on briefly, which is Europe itself. You know, both of those horrific wars, World War I and II, started in Europe, which is why, again, in 1944-45, Roosevelt and of course later Truman were seeking 2 points of strategic focus. One, against the Soviet Union, obviously, but the second, to keep Europe unified under a set of understandings that not only would move toward European unity, but also European security. And that is why, for example, in the wake of World War II, we were great advocates of something called the European Steel and Coal Community in the early 1950s. We saw that as a means of preserving and enhancing European unity. It's why we were supporters of its eventual successor, the European Union, for all of the frustrations that bureaucracy in the EU can provide a strategic good. So that's why I think the centrality of keeping NATO and the EU on the same page and together is critical. And the administration gets this. The more thoughtful members of it do recall what happens if we decide we're not going to lead. That is how we got that awful refugee crisis. You know, it wasn't our problem. So it simply got worse and worse, creating huge disunity inside Europe, as well as the humanitarian suffering that it occasioned. So, you know, keeping the focus on unity within Europe, which we've got right now. I mean, problematic states in the recent past, like Hungary under Viktor Orban, which was starting to sound an awful lot like a 1938 principality. Well, Hungarians are not making those noises now, and they are in support of the NATO and EU-wide sanctions regime. So that becomes absolutely critical, and I think those would be the biggest differences. But in point of similarity, you know, without just tossing this out there without marshaling all my facts behind it, the Holocaust and World War II are still in living memory. So for anyone to say never again, really? There really couldn't be another European engendered global conflict, a European engendered massacre of thousands and even millions of people, because they've done it before. So that is why I think we've got to be so careful.
Are you there, Ambassador? Okay.
I had a blip. Yeah. Are we reconnected?
Yeah,
are
you're
you-
connected.
Okay. So yeah, that is
At least you are with me anyway.
Yeah, we're
Okay.
good.
okay. Yeah. So
Okay.
that'd be my my quick response on the, is this 1938 over again?
Right. Well, Europe's
So,
unified
Ambassador,
now. Anyway, back to you, Dave.
Ambassador, I have a question or two myself. I wanted to ask you. Do you think? I don't know if you saw Liz Cheney on Meet the Press this past weekend. She talked about right up front. We kept saying we weren't going to fight in Ukraine. We weren't going to help them fight. NATO wasn't going to help defend them. Pretty much that they were on their own. And she felt that was a mistake, and that we should have said things like, we're going to keep all options on the table. How do you feel about that?
I'm glad for the follow-up. You may recall at the beginning, talking about the administration's response, I thought that I said that in large part, they have done this about as well as it can be done. The one thing they did not, I would agree with Liz Cheney on this. I am a veteran of a number of international negotiations, and what you don't do is make a preemptive concession. It's just negotiation 101. So I would have said it just as she framed it. And as previous presidents of both parties have said, we're not taking anything off the table. Clearly, we're not going to be leaping forward to use it, but you leave it on the table and let the Russians worry about what it might or might not mean.
You also, in your talk, you likened what happened in Aleppo and in Syria and in Ukraine. You kind of mentioned that in comparison to the Holocaust. Is that how you see those?
Well,
to a lesser degree, maybe.
Thank God there has only been one Holocaust. None of this rises to that level. And it would be horrific to think it ever could. My point simply is that no one thought there was going to be a Holocaust the first time around. There is a great darkness, I think, in the soul of Europe. Those forces that perpetrated the Holocaust and those that enabled it, they're still out there, let's face it. And one of the chilling aspects of the Holocaust was kind of the banalization of the whole thing. And we've seen that in some of the recent decisions by, for example, European railway authorities producing some compensations because they were transporting Jews to the camps. That what was going on, again, the banalization of evil, that these people, the Jews, just became a commodity, that you had to get X boxcars of product from A to B, and you could conveniently forget what the product was or what was going to happen to them when you got to B. And that, human nature doesn't change overnight. Again, I'm not by any means labeling all of Europe as neo-Nazis or anything like it, but dark and awful things grew in Europe in the absence of a significant U.S. presence. The factors and the attitudes that allowed those things to develop, you've got to assume are still there. They don't, never again. It's a great slogan, but you had better use that as a rallying point for positive integration and involvement, and not as an excuse to ignore it all, that because it could never happen again. Well, it could.
that why you say the U.S. has to play that role?
Well, again, if we don't play it, no one will. And we have seen through the first half of the 20th century what happened in Europe when we decided not to play that role. And I would very much hope we would take that aboard as we look to our collective future.
Jeff, you have another question from the audience?
Sure. There's a question here, and I think you've answered it. It asks about to what extent was the U.S. government's hasty and disorganized exit from Afghanistan a factor in Putin's decision? I think you've covered that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, simply that Afghanistan, I fear, is the gift that's going to keep on giving. It's fallen from the headlines now with the Ukraine situation. But its impact, I'm afraid, is going to be around for a long while. I mentioned the Pakistani issue. They're looking really shaky, and the thought that a government with nuclear weapons being overthrown, that is truly terrifying. And I could go on in other dimensions. You have a kind of a perfect storm scenario in India and in China, for that matter, where in India, where the policies of Prime Minister Modi against Kashmiri Muslims have completely alienated them from the Indian state and angered them. Right at the same time, we have the collapse in Afghanistan and the jolt of adrenaline that is given to, I think, Islamic militants everywhere. Watch that space. I would very concerned now of a strong possibility of an Afghan influenced act of violence of some major scale into India. We did have that unfortunate rocket launch, kind of accidentally, and kind of amazing how both countries kept their cool on that one. But the fact that they kept their cool, I think, reflects how grave the situation is. Both understood that you do not want to let this one get away. In China, of course, what the Chinese state has done to its Uyghur Muslim population in the West, going to make that right for the emergence of a possibly violent movement inside China. We've already seen linkages between some elements of the Chinese Uyghur community and violent militants in the Pakistani-Afghanistan area. Those connections have already been there. They're likely to get a big boost again from the success of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So watch this space. It's not in the headlines anymore, but it's still out there, and it could get very dangerous.
Right on.
I have another question for you, Ambassador. We still have bases in Korea and Germany. Do you think it would have been wise to leave a small base, or 2 or 3 or even 4 bases in the Middle East?
Well, we have a number of military facilities in the Middle East. The base at Al Udeid in Qatar, a critical facility for us for all of our area deployments. We retain that. We have facilities or access to facilities as well in a number of the other Gulf states, in Bahrain, where our 5th Fleet is headquartered, in Kuwait for some of our air assets, and on down the Gulf as well. So we are not by any means absent from the region. We have maintained our facilities there. One of the many problems we now have with the Afghan withdrawal is that it is a long way from any of those bases or from our aircraft carriers into landlocked Afghanistan. So somehow the notion that the administration tried to retail that our counterterrorism efforts against enemies in Afghanistan will continue after our withdrawal of forces, well, that is just disingenuous. Anybody who has any familiarity with these matters know that if you don't have on the ground intelligence assets, and if you don't have on the ground basing and resupply facilities, which obviously we have neither in Afghanistan now, your effectiveness is greatly diminished. This is a point Bill Burns, as director of the CIA, made months ago for the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. So yes, we do have some pretty critical facilities elsewhere in the Middle East, but to give up, we weren't forced out, we gave up in Afghanistan, and then to say we didn't lose any of our capabilities, that's just ridiculous.
Well, let me rephrase the question. Actually what I meant was, should we have left some bases in Iraq and in Afghanistan?
Well, certainly, Afghanistan was an unforced error. We were helping the government maintain broad control with an ever diminishing set of forces. I mean, I think we'd gotten into a red zone by the end of the Trump administration when he made his final cut from 5,000 to 2,500, which turned out to be more like 3,000 or over that. But at that time, I reflected on my own experience as an ambassador, a decade ago. When I left Afghanistan in 2012, we had over 100,000 troops, which we were drawing down. The Taliban controlled none of the 34 provincial capitals. At the end of the Trump administration, with 5,000, the Taliban controlled no provincial capitals. So I thought we had a pretty good and pretty inexpensive insurance policy with a minimal number of troops, not directly engaged in combat, but both symbolically and through their critical training and logistical support, were allowing the Afghan government to at least hold its own against the Taliban. So we were not forced out of Afghanistan by any means. We just decided we're done. We're impatient. Let's get on with it. Not our problem anymore. I mean, the good news is, on a point of critical national security for our country, the Trump and Biden administrations had basically identical views. The bad news is it was dead wrong to pull us out of Afghanistan when we were not taking heavy casualties, not expending vast amounts of American treasure any longer. We just decided we're done. And again, as someone who has wrestled over the years of the inherent contradictions between our values as Americans and our national security interests, in the sense of the rights of individuals to pursue their own version of happiness and freedom. Afghanistan was one of those rare occasions when our values and our security interests coincided. That maintaining an atmosphere in which the other half of the population, the female half, could pursue education, could go into business, into teaching, into the military, our presence there was able to support that, and in the process, I think, to make Afghan society more secure. So we not only gave up or put at risk our national security objectives, I firmly believe we tarnished and damaged our own ideals. And I was really deeply disappointed in some of my progressive acquaintances whose, as we saw it play out, it seemed that their dislike of the American military overcame their much vaunted attachment to the rights of women and girls anywhere. No prominent progressive voices were raised in this country to say, if we pull our forces out, women are going to get it in the neck. And I find that shameful.
Jeff?
Thank you. This question's been raised in various forms throughout from our chat and as prep for this. But the big question that comes down to, where does Putin go from here? Hypothetically, let's say he succeeds in Ukraine. Where does his aggression end?
Yeah, it's a it sounds like a simple question, but of course it isn't. When one looks at the neighborhood and one looks at Putin's behavior, well, there are a couple of other countries out there that are not members of NATO or the EU. Moldova comes to mind. Georgia, where Putin has already flexed muscle and could flex it again. And simply put, again, if he succeeds in the Ukraine, first you have to define what succeed would mean. Then that is when the World War II analogy perhaps becomes a little more accurate. We all know the infamous mission of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, to Munich to meet with Hitler, to say that he had brought back peace in our time by surrendering the Sudetenland to the Nazis. Did that appease them? Absolutely not. It inspired him. And I think that is the the regional perspective we have to maintain. Again, if Putin succeeds, then I think you're going to see real estate prices drop precipitously in a couple of other Eastern European states. But now, the good news is, if you will, I don't see how he's going to succeed. I'm not sure how many forces he has committed right now. But the Ukrainians have made it clear. I mean, they're going to fight street to street. If he couldn't do this in the first week or 10 days, take the whole country, it's a very long shot that he's going to be able to ever do that. So the question then becomes, how does a standoff get resolved into a stable and lasting peace? Well, I got no answers on that one, but it is certainly on the minds of this administration and of our European allies. But, Putin is, again, presiding over a collapsing economy. He did not get the quick win in Ukraine that he was counting on, and is unlikely to get it unless he makes a huge increased commitment of forces. Then what? How does this then get wound down into a relatively stable, enduring cessation of hostilities? I haven't got the answer to that one.
Are you concerned he might use nuclear weapons?
Again, I can't read anybody's mind, including my own, so I certainly am not gonna try to read his. Um, um, I do not think you can look into his eyes and see his soul. Um, uh, so I just don't know. I think, again, depending on how this moves forward in the coming weeks, I wouldn't rule out a situation in which he might use battlefield nukes.
Is that, you're concerned then about the talk of him being backed into a corner?
And look, if he's backed into a corner, he backed himself into it. You know, he launched a very ill-advised offensive. You know, what were his generals thinking of? Well, this is the difference between autocracies and democracies, isn't it? That also gets into an administration itself. I doubt if Russian generals are much in the habit of telling Vladimir Putin that this is a really bad idea. And it is turning out to be a really bad idea. So he's not being cornered anywhere. He took on Ukraine. Ukraine is not likely to invade Russia anytime soon. So is he really going to risk nuclear holocaust to somehow magically get him out of a situation that he voluntarily chose to risk? But again, I think that is why the administration has been careful to at least maintain some connectivity with him. Now, there is word this evening, obviously I haven't looked at anything in this past hour, where it is it's getting out there that Putin may break diplomatic relations with us. That means the embassy closes and the flag comes down, and we are no longer in verbal contact with our adversary. It would be another escalation, and an ill-advised one, but he's been ill-advised from the beginning on this.
Do you think that's a reaction to President Biden calling him a war criminal?
Yeah, again, I can't begin to speculate on what makes his mind work. He might have taken that as a compliment.
Gary. Yes, more audience questions?
Sure. Let's see. I'm going to change directions. I mean, we could talk about Ukraine all night, but given what's gone on there, Taiwan seems to loom in the minds of many of us, and China and what they're learning. So I guess you might consider this a multifaceted question. What do you think China's takeaway is, especially as relates to Taiwan? And what can we do to betrust Taiwan?
Yeah, again, it's a great question because it opens up that whole window on China, its thinking, its priorities, and so forth. What we saw really right after the fall of Kabul, the Chinese, I think through their foreign ministers, sending a message to Taiwan saying, hey guys, do you really think your American buddies are gonna bail you out if we come for you? Maybe you better think again. So pretty clear, again, the long range impact of our decision to toss in the towel in Afghanistan, rippling around the world quite literally. And the Chinese now are in a kind of a challenging position for them. Clearly seen an interest in Russia not being defeated, if you will, in Ukraine, but also not comfortable with the tension this is causing within their own strategic logic and the way they portray themselves. You know, one of the elements of China's foreign policy has always been the sanctity of recognized borders. So I think they're kind of twitchy about the whole Ukraine thing. And, you know, the longer it drags on, the harder it's going to be to justify support for Putin, particularly given the fact that as you kind of do your strategic calculus, it's hard to come up with any scenarios that would suggest a long-term strategic partnership between Russia and China. I mean, during the years of the Cold War, we saw periods of rapprochement between the two, Beijing and Moscow, but they were tactical, be driven by a particular issue and not sustainable over the longer term. So watch that space, both vis-a-vis China vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also China vis-a-vis Russia, to see where all this goes. And again, having really created a catastrophic situation for us by his Afghan withdrawal, it may be that President Biden has now, with his sustained and manageable policy toward Ukraine, is causing the Chinese to rethink their rethinking vis-a-vis Taiwan and the United States.
Yeah, I got a follow up though there, and I don't disagree in any way. But that, as you kind of alluded, that relationship has always been transactional, it seems like. And at this point, especially given Russia being on the back foot and having a limited opportunity to sell its natural resources, China seems to loom incredibly large with leverage. And would it not be unreasonable to assume that eventually China will leverage that leverage to the point where it engenders bitterness on the part of the Russians?
Yeah, it's a good follow on there, and I think all part of the difficulty those two capitals have had and will continue to have in finding the basis for a long-term strategic relationship. Frankly, I would be not surprised in the next couple of weeks, again, depending on how things go on the ground in Ukraine, where you might begin to see some Chinese distancing from Russia over the quagmire that Putin seems to have constructed for himself. It's, again, I've never met Putin, I've never met Xi, can't begin to pontificate on what they're thinking in their inmost recesses. But I would say this, we have not seen a Chinese leader like Xi since Mao Zedong himself, where he is now president for life. There were always a certain number of checks, if not balances, inside the Chinese system, where the leader never really had full authority or control over the entire establishment. The party could move against, and did move against, a Chinese leader. The Xi regime, no. He is a fully unreconstructed autocrat. The danger there is perhaps very similar to the danger with Putin. When you are in a completely unchallenged position of power, you can make some really colossal mistakes, just going on your own judgment. So that, I think, too, would be a global risk, that just as it is in Russia, all Putin all the time, so it is in China, as far as I can tell. It's all Xi all the time. And that, I think, produces some pretty dangerous scenarios when literally one man can call all the shots.
Is there something we should be doing now to ensure the security of Taiwan
We did send
more
a
than what we're doing?
we did send a delegation of none of them currently serving officials, but individuals of real stature and very well known in around the world, including in China and Taiwan. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, was one of them. I think the administration needs to continue to find ways to signal both to the Chinese regime and to the Taiwanese that we are definitely continuing to view Taiwan as a top tier strategic issue for us, and would react badly and possibly unpredictably should the Chinese attempt direct aggression against Taiwan. So.
Jeff? I've got a couple here from the audience if you're out of them.
No, I got
Go
one more here. This is kind of an interesting one I hadn't thought of, someone brought up. And it really comes down to, is there more to just the obvious in why Putin invaded Ukraine? Are there other resources that Ukraine has related to green energy that is also a driver? Sorry about that.
Yeah, again, a great question. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier about Hitler's view of Ukraine. You know, it has been at different points in the past a huge agrarian economy that was exporting far and wide its crops. So Putin may have a grand plan for that. And again, it all comes back to that question of the economy. He annexed the Crimea, which frankly is a sucking chest wound for Russia. And they generate zero income and they are costing a whole lot of rubles to maintain. So it may be that Putin, in addition to all of the quasi historical myths about the Ukraine and Russia that go back hundreds of years, it may be that he saw a Ukraine fully owned and occupied by Russia as a major economic asset, primarily through its agricultural potential. But equally clearly now, 5 weeks into this mess that he's created for himself, that ain't gonna come to a field near you anytime soon. That Russian losses and costs just up to now are going to outweigh any economic advantages they might somehow realize in the future by a huge amount. But again, that's pure speculation on my part. It is, though, a fact that over its millennial history, Ukraine has been a major agricultural producer that, again, with surpluses that went far beyond its own borders.
We're about out of time, Ambassador. Do you have any concluding remarks or thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Well, just to reemphasize the point about American leadership and how critical it has been for a world more or less at peace for 75 years since the end of World War II. There is no other power that can play that role. It's us or it's a completely different system. And I would just urge all of us to bear that in mind. Yeah, we got things we need to spend money on at home. We all get that. But boy, oh boy, letting the world get away from us can turn out to be a really expensive proposition in ways that you really don't like to imagine. So, I mean, I think it is a time to take a deep breath and consider where we want our country to go and where we want the world to go. And that in that process that we reflect on what we're doing to each other. Again, the venomous now political debate, if you can even call it that, is not doing this country any good. It is perhaps our greatest point of strategic weakness right now, that we are so divided among ourselves that we're now engendering comparisons to the Civil War in this country. And we have got to find a better way to talk about and reconcile our interests and our concerns. Just don't look to Washington for anything along those lines anytime soon, because it isn't going to come from Washington. If we can do it at all, it is going to have to be at the local level. And that is why groups such as PEG become so important, to engender an atmosphere where you can have talks about real issues that are highly polarizing, but to get it out on the table and have a respectful discussion in which it is not all shouting, but actually some listening. I said for years overseas, you know, the strength of American democracy, in my estimation, didn't reside on Capitol Hill or at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It resided in our town councils and our school boards. Well, our town councils and our school boards are now heavily polarized, and really in a very dangerous way. This is a great country. We are a great people. We need to reflect a bit on that. We need to reflect on the huge challenges we face abroad, and to recognize that simple fact. We are America. We are Americans. We have done great things, and we can continue to do great things for our own country and for the world. But boy, we've got to find a different way for a political dialogue than the one we're embarked on now. So again, I commend you and all your colleagues and everyone tuned in on this. It was like America in Afghanistan. Nobody can take this away from us. It's only us who can give it away, and give away the country we all hold so dear in the process. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing these important colloquia. And I hope that leads to, again, a broader and more civil dialogue among us all, whatever our political differences.
Well, thank you. That's very well said. And on behalf of the PEG board and membership, we wish to extend our sincerest gratitude to you for this important discussion. It was extremely interesting. In closing, I'd like to say that PEG is a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you are finding these events helpful, please join us as a member or make a donation to PEG. We are a nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. Please visit our website at pegnow.org. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you again to Ambassador Crocker for a tremendous presentation tonight. A video of this evening's forum will be posted on PEG's website in a couple of weeks. And thanks again to TBW for covering this event, streaming it, and recording it as well. So with that, thank you and good night.
Thanks, Dave. Good night.
Night.